From Chicago, welcome to 3Degrees Discussions. I'm your host, Mike Vasquez. This is a podcast devoted to the stories behind the innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders in the 3D printing industry.
The close relationship with my father. I mean, there are 5 kids, and I'm the only one that went to aerospace, but I just felt a special, close relationship with him, actually. And for a while, we lived in Seattle when I was young, and all of my friends' parents worked at Boeing. I mean, that was like the industry at the time. Now there's Microsoft and Amazon, but at the time it was Boeing.
That was Melissa Orme. Melissa belongs to that small group of engineers who have participated hands-on in the field of additive manufacturing before the term or even the industry of additive manufacturing even existed. Her career has been divided between academia and business. On the academic front, she worked as a professor at UCI for 12 years. After rising to full professor, Melissa relinquished her tenure at UCI in favor of joining her family in Athens, Greece, where they lived for 6 years. After returning to the US, Melissa joined Morph 3D as Chief Technology Officer. Morph 3D is a company that is focused on additive manufacturing of metallic components, primarily for the Aerospace and Defense Industry. In 2019, Melissa joined the Boeing Company as Vice President of Additive Manufacturing. In that capacity, Melissa continues to grow and scale additive manufacturing capabilities and help to rapidly expand understanding of the unique features that 3D printing can bring to factories, production lines, all while improving safety and quality. Before we get started, head over to www.3degreescompany.com and subscribe to the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the show anywhere you download your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or Stitcher. Well, thank you so much for joining the show today, Melissa. I'm excited to kind of talk to you and get your full career story because I think it's one of the more amazing stories in the industry. And why don't we just get started with kind of how did you get interested in aerospace manufacturing in general? Kind of what was the spark?
Well, okay, so I was interested in aerospace, before additive manufacturing. Really, my father was an engineer for Boeing, and we were very close, and I was always just thought that was a really cool, area, and followed in his footsteps basically. But I went, I didn't make a specific decision to go for graduate school. That, it's interesting how things sort of happened. But I graduated from USC with a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering. And then I was doing research at the time. And my faculty advisor just said, Melissa, why don't you, continue for a master's? Because the research you're doing really warrants a master's degree. And I did that. And he said, well, you should really stay for a PhD. And so, that was not planned, and it was, paid for. And I really liked what I was doing. And so what I was doing really led to then, my beginning footsteps into additive manufacturing. So my research all the way from undergraduate was basically controlling streams of molten metal droplets. I began with oil as an undergrad. And sort of like drop-on-demand printing, inkjet printing, but in a different way. Inkjet printing just pulses out, droplets at rates, say, 5,000 hertz, and, prints characters, right? And so I basically developed another way where we take capillary streams and we apply a forcing disturbance onto the surface, which causes that to break into drops. And that can, produces droplets at a much higher frequency, like, 50,000 drops per second, or, depending on other things. So much higher frequency. And I created ways, which was really my PhD thesis at the time, of manipulating the droplet sizes, kind of like sending code with droplet diameters, if you will, and separations. So I could create these streams of droplets with a deterministic separation and sizes of drops. So you can kind of customize, how these droplets come out. And so what I was doing also is electrostatically charging and deflecting them. So I could steer them. And I could steer the small ones at some place and the larger ones another place and so forth. And then about that time, net form manufacturing was starting to become a thing. right? It was before, this was a long time ago, before we had powder bed machines. Right, stereolithography was just developing. We visited the folks, Chuck Hull, and he was in Valencia at the time, and the people in Austin were developing the powder bed. So it was very nascent as a technology. And clearly, learning about this in industry, thinking, well, if I could do this with molten metal, that'd be pretty cool. And so I started working postgraduate with metals instead of, the oil that I was working with. So I started with solder and then aluminum, and, began steering these metal droplets at very high rates onto substrates. And then I got a faculty position at the University of California, Irvine. And I created some labs, got some nice research funding from National Science Foundation, DARPA, and a few other, Lawrence Livermore, things like places like that, and really started developing this further. Of course, in the university now, I'm looking at the fluid mechanic spreading of the droplets coupled with heat transfer, phase change, that dynamic coupled, and the resulting microstructure. So sort of looking at it on a basic science point of view, but at the same time trying to industrialize that. And simultaneously, while I was an assistant professor, I created a startup company, which was at the time called RAD, right? Which for Rapid Analysis and Development.
Because you weren't busy enough, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? And so that company was funded by a company that doesn't exist now called Modern Printing Methods. And they were printing electronic circuit boards, solder paste. With their traditional product was, solder paste templated, circuit boards. And so the idea was to print these solder balls onto patterns for ball grid arrays and other components. So we created a startup on the side and developed a machine and a platform that was able to do this, make these small ball grid arrays in like a millisecond, where it typically is a pick and place. It takes like, many orders magnitude of time further. So that was very successful. And then, that company was bought by another company, which, anyway, a lot of, things happened, which caused that invention essentially to be warehoused, so that the initial technology company could continue, right?
Was it common at the time to were a lot of your colleagues in the academic ranks doing startups, or was there kind of a culture around it?
No. So it really wasn't common, and I was an assistant professor too at the time. But, I made sure that the consulting hours were, in agreement with what was, allowed by the university. And, there's to have certain numbers you're allowed to consult. And so I was doing that as a, consultant, but really directed the rest of the employees, on a day-to-day basis, as well as the long-term strategy. So, that was really interesting, and I learned a lot about business, and as well as creating a technology for use, not just research, because my research laboratory at the university, it's wires all over the place, and it's like certainly not user friendly, right? And then. So I'm in the university also creating this net form manufacturing, making some good progress and doing this other on the side. And then I stepped away, which is another odd thing about my career. And the reason is very personal. My husband is Greek, and he came to this country as a graduate student, having done his undergraduate in Greece, and he went to Caltech for graduate studies with the assumption he'd always just return. But life got in the way. He was offered a position at USC as a professor. He rose to the rank of full professor, and we met, we got married. I also became full professor. We're happy in our academic lives, right? We had children, but he always had this desire to go back to his country. And when our children, I have twins, when they reached the first grade, we said, if we don't just make this move and go back to Greece, then we probably wouldn't, because it's too hard to uproot kids when they're involved in all their, sports and their friends and things like that. So, I really wanted to support him. He would never say anything negatively, but I didn't want to be that reason that kept him from that nostalgic dream of moving back to his country. So I relinquished my tenure, which is, really unusual because it's something that's quite sought after. It basically guarantees you salary for life, right? And it's hard to earn. And but I relinquished that, and we packed everything. We sold our house. We moved to Greece. And, I became involved in some aspects there in technologies, really supporting his invention on a whole different topic, but working that. Fast forward, 6 years, there's like an economic crisis in Greece. And so we come back. And also our kids were, in middle school, and we figure they'll probably go to the university in America. They better start taking classes in English. And because they were speaking, in Greek. And so we came back. And so at that point, I knew I couldn't get another position in the university because I hadn't been, publishing the requisite number of publications per year. So that, I was looking for another opportunity. And ultimately, Ivan found me from Morph 3D. And so I was the second employee, him being the first, right? And, we really just formed that company, and that was really good. It was really hard, I'll say, in the beginning, forming a new company and becoming AS9100 qualified in a record time, and then becoming qualified supplier for Boeing and Honeywell, and really building up that customer base while creating the process documentation of fixed flow, which is really important for quality. So I was brought on as Chief Technology Officer. And at that point, I thought that was, bringing my career full cycle, because in the university, I was working on research and development. And now I was working on the machines that had been produced in the time while I was gone. And we were producing metal hardware parts for industry. And, I did that for over 4 years. And then I got a call from Boeing, the chief technology officer of Boeing, asking me if I wanted to lead the additive activities at Boeing. And I hadn't expected that. I mean, that wasn't, and it's really funny. Almost everything I had done in my has not been part of the plan, right? But, I always like to make choices based on growth. Is there something that I can learn? And also assuming that I can contribute to the new position. But I always want to be learning. And I had never worked in a large corporation before. So I've gone academia, small business, now large corporation. And I like challenges. And so, so I agreed, and I've been there now almost 2 years, and I have learned a lot. I continue to learn, but it's been really, really good. And now I feel like kind of full cycle, yeah, until the next thing comes, a really, I feel like I've gone from academia, small business, large corporation, and additive manufacturing, and we've really matured the industry the whole way. So it's been a really cool ride.
So kind of stepping back in terms of the timeline. So when you were kind of growing up, you said your dad was a employee at Boeing. So was there something specific that drew you to technology or flight? When I had been I spent a little time in kind of Southern California, and you kind of get the sense there's like Hollywood as an industry, but also aerospace is huge.
Yeah.
Like your neighbors and things like that would probably be somewhere in the space. But was there something like conversation or just
I think it's just the closeness the close relationship with my father. I mean, there are 5 kids, and I'm the only one that went into aerospace, but I just felt a special, close relationship with him, actually. And for a while, we lived in Seattle when I was young, and all of my friends' parents worked at Boeing. I mean, that was like the industry at the time. Now there's Microsoft and Amazon, but at the time it was Boeing. And it was, just the thing to do at that point. But, I always knew I had any option really, but I was interested in airplanes. For a while I took flying lessons, they're just amazing machines, that fly. I was always just interested.
So as you're kind of dabbling in kind of, so call it kind of 3D printing in its very early days, but like, was there like a point in time where you kind of felt like, hey, like this is kind of an industry that is like kind of growing, like I'm helping to grow it. Like, was there like a specific turning point that you said, hey, like this this has gone from like academic, like people are doing stuff in labs, but
Oh yeah. In fact, we weren't even calling it 3D printing at the time. We were really calling it net form manufacturing and solid freeform fabrication. And I remember being in a workshop with a bunch of folks from MIT and some other, we were academic, probably some government labs too. And that's where we coined the phrase 3D printing. And I remember saying, it would be like having a fax machine that gives you a 3D printed part. Yeah. That's how early it was. You send a file and out comes, it's like a fax, but it's a 3D printed tangible piece of hardware. So then, and that was like when would that have been? That would have been in early 1990 or 87, 88, something like that. Where we really thought that was, I saw it as industry back there, something that we will do. I didn't imagine at the time, though, all the challenges, to be honest with you. There are a lot. Yeah.
Was there something more like, as you reflect on it even today, like something that you didn't foresee or that you're like, hey, like I knew that was going to be an issue going, or like,
no, there was a lot I didn't foresee. I'll be honest with you. I didn't know anything about what it takes to certify a part for the FAA. Back then, I had no experience there, and I didn't realize that the machines would have to be demonstrated to be repeatable and reliable, just on one machine as well as machine to machine. Issues like that. I would never have thought. I would have probably thought, oh well, the machine manufacturers will deal with that, and in theory, you can solve that, right? But that's an issue right now because machine manufacturers, they're not, at this point, making these industrialized, meaning that if I have two of the exact same machines and I open up the cabinetry, I would expect to see the exact same wiring pattern and the exact same length of ducts, and I don't, right? And that makes a difference. Those are things that we can accomplish, though. That doesn't seem that hard. It's not a really it's just a matter of doing it, right? And the other things, another thing that is a little unexpected, but I understand now, especially working at Boeing, is the perceived risk, right? And the hesitancy to design for additive from the big players like Boeing. And there's good reason for that, right? Because engineers are taught to design with reduced risk. And so that means design to a process that has decades of data, right? That's going to prove they understand, exactly how this part will behave in 20 years or whatever. And if you have it sitting in storage, you know what's going to happen when you pull it out in 2 decades. And additive doesn't have that. Right. And so we have homework to do still as a community to prove that we understand how to mitigate that risk, that we have the data, we have the maturity, we have the expertise, and that we can prove to all the designers that, we can mitigate that risk because we understand. But we're not there yet. right? And so, there's massive amounts of testing that erodes a business case, right? And then if there's no business case, people say, well, why are you doing it if it's so expensive? Because you're testing every single part and CT scanning every single part, and right? And so, clearly I had never thought of all those aspects because I just didn't understand what it took.
Right. And even today, I mean, that's a challenge even for a specific system like DMLS, and there's different flavors of that, but it seems like every month or quarter, there's a new spin on a different process, and you have all these different vendors with selling multiple processes. And so how it's almost, I mean, probably from where you're sitting, like there's so many different parts and so many applications. How do you pick the so-called winner technologies that you can afford to
exactly
invest that time in?
Because after you invest in a certain process, right, the certain modality, say DMLS, you want to stay the course on that, right? And so, however, we're continuously evolving as a industry, right? And we need to be able to have ways to stay agile and open-minded to new technologies. And I think that, in time, I mean, DMLS is great, but we probably will be using it less next decade, let's say, right? But it's really important now because it helps us work out all of the pitfalls and nuances and explain to engineers, what the value is, how you can redesign, how you can do all these cool things with internal features. So it's a necessary step, but we have to really keep our minds open for new technologies. And so we have to adapt ways that we can, show equivalency with data sets and things like that. And that's not been ironed out yet in industry. We're working on that, even from machine to machine. If we go from one manufacturer with a big data set, and then we have a brand new manufacturer, do we have to start all over with that whole data set? Or can we show equivalency somehow? And that's what we're working out right now. So with Boeing. And
kind of going back to your time at Morph 3D, like that's kind of on the flip side where you're really probably you're staking a company thesis on a particular type of machine, right? I mean, this is my guess, and I'd love to hear the story behind it. But like as a small company, you don't have $100 million to make a mistake on buying a DMLS system versus a powder bed versus an FDM. So can you talk about like that decision early on to kind of jump into additive where it wasn't like, there wasn't necessarily supply chain pull or like push, like Boeing wasn't throwing parts at like, hey, buy a machine, like you can fill it for the year, but there's still some risk there.
So, my partner at the time, the founder of the company, Ivan Madera, I mean, it was really his brainchild. And he brought me on after he had already, said, this is what we're going to do. And I said, this is great. So he basically was just looking for the next technology and went to some conferences and learned, without having any real technical background. He's a businessman. He thought this was something that he wanted to do because he saw a future there, which I think is really cool, right? It took a lot of guts to do that, right? And so he formed this company and he went with the EOS maker, primarily because they were really good partners. They gave him really good terms, and he reached out to most of them actually, and it was because of the partnership aspect with the EOS that he went there. And then once you're with a particular machine maker, you're hopeful that your customers want those machines, right? And so that was, he also knew that EOS was really one of the first to market, right? And so there's a good chance that the customers, being the Boeings or the Honeywells or the Raytheons, would also be using that machine. But I think that he's also had it in his mind that if a customer wants has parts that need to be printed on a specific other machine, he'd go for that too, right? So I think he has always, been saying it's his more 3D's machine, the capacity that they have is really driven by customer, and always in terms of machine type, in terms of materials that they use and things like that. It's customer driven.
Sure. And was the idea too for most of the parts that you guys were working on, was it, and when you partner with a Boeing or Honeywell, was it to do kind of prototyping or kind of functional kind of end parts, like being a partner in testing, validating processes? Like when a big company is looking to partner with a kind of manufacturer like that, what's it kind of a typical kind of ask?
The typical ask. So it was that, the company would manage everything from, the development aspect. This was the Morph 3D model, to producing hardware, to managing the post processing, from of course depowdering with support removal, heat treatment, machining, and then the part would be tested with the company. With they know their requirements. They need to be the tester, the testing authority, but Morph 3D would also manage the testing of in-process coupons, send them out, bring them in. But of course, the company, the Boeing or whatever, would be in charge of the analysis of the data, right? That wasn't Morph 3D's job. So they would manage where the parts go, and the analysis aspects would all be the authority of the company, the customer.
Yeah, and I mean, still that ecosystem, kind of, there are others companies that do similar things to Morph it, but it's still pretty nascent, throughout the industry, and it'll be interesting. I'm always curious. I was kind of asking this at AMUG, kind of as you see some of these suppliers and consolidation and various technologies, like if I'm a car manufacturer and I find a part that's, hey, there's an awesome business case for 3D printing, like, where do I go for that? And if I'm the small, medium-sized manufacturer, like that justification of buying, and still somewhat a risky asset, especially if it's not a core technology, because it can be time consuming to set up. And
there's a steep learning curve. And so if you're like a machine shop, I mean, people say, is it good for machine shops to go into additive manufacturing? I'm not sure, because typically the parts that they get in machine shops, they can machine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they probably should machine if you can, right? You really need to be involved, I think, with the engineers, right, who are providing the machine shop the part, from the customer before that, to help, identify where you should be using additive. And then it needs to be redesigned, so you can exploit the value of additive, right? You can lightweight it, you can use topology optimization, you can, have your dual functionality with maybe cooling or, whatever you want to do. But and then it will become probably not able to be machined traditionally, right? And then if it goes back to that machine shop, there's a steep learning curve on how to actually do that. It's I've known several people who just buy machine shops who buy a 3D printer, and they don't it sits there because the learning curve is really, really tough. So I'm not sure that's the right move. I kind of like the approach more where, really like the Morph 3D approach, where you just say, I am fully focused on becoming an expert in additive manufacturing and putting all my resources there, rather than this little side job, for some parts.
Right. And I'm sure as well, and you probably can comment on this throughout your career, is like kind of thinking about how you build a team to support an additive business is a little bit, it's unique than,
every team is slightly different, but like there's different considerations that you would have in terms of building a team at Morph versus a machine shop, right? Where you may be limited.
Yeah, exactly. And so you need a little bit of everything, I mean, you have the engineers who are, good designers, right? And they'll spot things, and then the setting up the build file, that's, that takes a lot of know-how. You never just use like default supports or parameters given from the company, right? So you need experts there. And getting that expertise, it takes time to grow, right? And then you have the technicians, and the technicians, it's really skilled labor. The folks that remove the support structures, for example, that's a bit of artistry. One wrong move and they can scrap, a $20,000 part, right? And so, we've had, technicians that are just awesome, and they just are, know exactly what they're doing in terms of removing supports. And I really think it's like fine craftsmanship. It's something that's really hard to find. It's I remember those folks are difficult to find. It's harder than a CNC programmer, for example, or something like that. And then setting up the machines and just loading and unloading them. It sounds like, just setting up the machines and loading and unloading them. Well, the way they're made today, there's still a lot of expertise in terms of leveling things, getting things aligned, and a lot of know-how and expertise there too. So there's a lot of training that's involved. And then you go to the ecosystem, right? Which hardly exists. The ecosystem that you need for all the post-processing, the stress relief, and then the hipping, and then the CT scanning, and maybe there's anodizing, and, depending on what your part needs. And that still needs to grow in the industry. I don't really think that we have that really figured out yet. There's a couple of companies that are coming on board that just want to do post-processing, which is, I think, a really good goal. But I don't think they have it quite figured out yet. They don't have everything end to end. And, all those things have to be NADCAP approved, and, have specific specifications. Sounds a little redundant to say that, but, and so, and then it needs to accept the scale, right? That we will have, because I think we will have an inflection point, and that suddenly, in maybe 23, 24, we're going to have a lot more additive activity. But that ecosystem needs to be in place. I'm not so sure that it is yet.
I would agree. And so kind of making the transition to Boeing, where it's a huge organization, and you're overseeing additive from a global level in a corporation that does space and commercial and defense. And so from a leadership position, kind of what's that like, kind of taking the message of additive within a corporation that's not like, it's not the main, it's not like more for that's the main business. It's part of a portfolio. Like, can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. So, what I see as part of my goal is to train engineers on, what is, where does additive bring value, right? I got to make sure that people aren't just, designing sheet metal brackets and things like that for additive. But what we're really trying to push is, and this doesn't work for heritage programs. It only works for new products, really. Basically use additive to create differentiating vehicles, that only additive can provide. Instead of optimizing a part, let's optimize the entire vehicle, right? And that doesn't mean by having a whole bunch of optimized parts, right? It means by taking the design and designing in small conforming spaces so that you can make things more streamlined, so it uses less fuel, or just more durable, increase performance, however you do that. And that's really, in my view, the end goal of optimizing vehicles rather than optimizing parts. Now for heritage programs, like commercial airplanes, we're still doing part for part replacements, and there's not as good a value there, because when you have a part for part replacement, you still rely on all the surrounding parts to fit it to, right? You have an existing bolt pattern, if you will, right? And so you can't shrink that, right? And so you can't, really optimize as much as you could if you were starting from scratch, right? And so, but we do have several parts that are like in line for production on commercial aircraft, because they allow us to learn. They allow us to work out our kinks, that we have with production. It allows us to establish our relationship with the FAA, to understand everything, all the data we need to provide. And so it's really useful. And the business knows that, even though the business case is not as good, right, because we haven't optimized it as much, and because we're testing the heck out of it, right? Because it's still very nascent, it's part of the learning process. And then we're looking forward to other, for example, in BDS and like satellites, we have a lot of new, projects coming forward, and it provides huge opportunity for really exploiting additive, right? Or in, other future programs, some of which I can't talk about, but, a whole new products, not necessarily in satellites, that allow us to start from a clean slate and say, okay, how should we design this if we're not constrained to traditional manufacturing, right? How can we optimize this product? So we're, with respect to Boeing, we're looking at it from many different aspects. BCA, which has, at this point, part for part replacements, but a lot of really good learning that's required, right? And then also the insertions that we've been making in satellites. There's been probably thousands of parts, right? And then that are on products. And then the future designing of really differentiating products rather than parts.
And kind of coming full circle, as a lot of the listeners that kind of tune into this podcast are, or I at least hope, are kind of on various parts of their kind of either manufacturing or additive manufacturing kind of career path, kind of your vast experience, kind of what advice would you give, kind of even looking back at your own career, kind of starting out, like, is there any kind of piece of advice that you would give, or thing that you should keep in mind as you're going through your career, and kind of if you're interested in manufacturing or 3D printing?
Well, I don't know if it would be specific to 3D printing or additive manufacturing. I mean, 3D print, for that I could say, but it would be the same for anything that you're passionate about, is follow your passion, right? And follow it hard. Right. And then, read whatever you can, from, the LinkedIn articles to the scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles. Know the subject, right? Know what people are doing in industry, know what people are doing in academia, right? Get as much information as you can, and follow it, follow your passion. And if with me, I've always, everything I've done, I've made some risky decisions, right? I gave up, academia. I've done a lot of, moves to a foreign country. I've, done things that are a little unconventional, but it's always been a calculated risk, saying what, and looking at life in the holistic sense, right? For example, when I left academia, the holistic sense meant, my family life had to be happy too, or else I couldn't be successful professionally. That's for me, right, personally. And so, I wanted to make sure that holistically, as a human being, that the choices I made for, family and professional, they kind of go together, right? So I've made a lot of sort of unconventional choices, that were measured risk. And each time, however, I always want to make sure that I'm learning and I'm growing and I'm, basically becoming better, as someone in industry, someone in academia, or a human being in general, right? So it's always a risk, but making sure that the next step is improvement in some way.
Absolutely. And so in kind of looking forward into the remainder of the year, kind of are there things you're excited about either from company perspective or learning about regarding the industry or kind of your own career?
Well, I mean, the remainder of the year, I am the most excited about like seeing people face to face and getting out of my home office. I have been vaccinated, and so I had my first trip in a year to meet the team in the Puget Sound 2 weeks ago, and that was so awesome. I'm looking forward to do that a lot more regularly, just to have the face to face, because that's part of we are, people, right? And what we do relies on the people, our team. Basically, I'm not responsible for the work. I'm responsible for the people who do the work, right? And it's really important to make sure that our team is healthy, not just physically, but, in being connected with each other and feeling, good about what we do. And so, that's really important to me, and I'm working on that, really just making sure that the team has what they need to do what our goals are for this year. And we have our goals lined out for 2021 and 2026, right? I mean, we have them, we have very specific goals, and we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of that has to do with the things I've already discussed, with, education, with qualification for FAA, for, designing new products. But there's a lot of really good stuff on the horizon that we're excited for. Really good.
Well, that's awesome. And thank you so much for sharing your story today. Very inspiring, and excited to see what else you and Boeing comes out with on the additive side in the coming years.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.
Cool.